Kia ora everyone, that's 12 by my watch, so we'll get started. It's great to have you here at today's open Zoom session on agriculture and forestry and the transition to low emissions. Co-Charlie Keeling Aho, I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll be taking us through this session today. First, we have our lovely commission team member Bevan with us, and he's going to lead us into the session with the karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora. He honore, he kororia ki te atua, he mangarongo ki te mata o te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa, hanga e te atua hi ngā kauhau, ki roto ki tēnā o mātou, whakatongia tō wairua tapu, hei awhina, hei tohu i a mātou, kororia ki tō ingoa tapu ake āmini. So for those of us who speak English, that's all honour and glory to our Maker. May peace and tranquility reign throughout the nation, goodwill and thoughts to all mankind. God establish within each and every one of us a wholesome spirit. Let your spiritual being grow within us to help and guide us forever. Amen. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan. Thank you. So it's great to see so many people on the webinar today. It's been a busy time for us here at the Commission. As you're all aware, we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 AM on the 1st of Feb, consultation on that draft advice opened to the public. So that means until the 14th of March, you can make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to the consultation page in the chat at the end of this session. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, and it's important to remember we're open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during this consultation period. So to start us off, could you please write your name and the organisation or community you represent and tell us where you're dialing in from in Aotearoa? Since we can't see your faces, it's nice to see who we've got joining us today. Kia ora, everyone. It's good to see people from all over New Zealand. So today you'll be hearing from our expert commissioners, Dr. Harry Clark and Professor Nicola Shadbolt. They'll be looking at what our recommendations say Aotearoa needs to do in the agriculture and forestry sectors to meet our climate targets. After each section, you'll have the chance to ask questions on what you've heard or what you want to find out. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. We won't have time to answer all of the questions, unfortunately, on this call, but we do have some of our expert analysts online to jump in and answer some of your questions in writing if we aren't going to get to ask them directly to Harry and Nicola. And if you do want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, feel free to use the chat. It's great to see conversation throughout the hour we've got here. That's enough for me for now. So I'll hand over to Nicola, and Harry will be kicking us off, and Amy will be taking us through our slides.
Great. All right. Well, we'll kick off, and yeah, lots of familiar names popping up on the screen. So welcome everybody. And to back up Charlie's comments, we're very keen to hear your comments, hear your contributions. This is a consultation phase, and what we have here is a starting point that I think is important for us to step through. Probably most importantly for us to step through exactly what our process was, so that you know what we've been tasked to do and what process we went through and why we've landed where we have, and that'll help guide some of the questions and perhaps put them into perspective as well. So in terms of our advice, so this is the next slide. Yeah. We were asked to provide advice on 4 main areas. And the first is the level of the first 3 emissions budgets from 2022 to 2035, the direction of policy for the emission reduction plan, and then we were asked 2 other additional questions outside of the Act, our Act that governs us, one around NDC and the other around methane. In terms of our advice and the role that we play here, for those of you who are into budgeting and certainly looking at the names, I know a lot of you are, we went through essentially what you call a reverse budgeting process, because we have our targets, we know what 2050 should be. And so therefore we were working back from that to look at the various pathways that actually delivered to those targets. We didn't start with, here we are, where could we be? We started with where we want to be and then worked back. So we looked at a number of pathways, headwinds, tailwinds, various ways in which we could actually get to those targets. I guess I certainly took some comfort out of the fact that we do believe we can meet those targets. That's important first lesson, I think, for me, out of the various models and the different things that we did. We had to make sure that out of that, then we would pull together recommendations around how that emissions reduction plan could work to actually get to those targets. We had to check, were they ambitious enough, or is it fair and equitable? Was it technically and economically feasible? And can it be achieved through policy? Because obviously some of this stuff will need policy as we go through. So I'll hand the next slide to Harry.
Thank you, Nicola. And you know, a new aspect of this from a New Zealand and in a sense a global perspective is that our Zero Carbon Act sets out a separate target for biogenic methane. And the majority of biogenic methane does come from agriculture, over 90%. And in the Act, it gives a target for 2030, a 10% reduction by 2030, and a range for 2050, 24 to 47%. So our task was to devise budgets that set us on a pathway to meet the targets in the Zero Carbon Act. And we believe that we've actually done that. And again, Nicola's slightly outlined our approach. It really was looking at where we would be going without further interventions on current policy and current settings. Where would we get to? How then could we introduce changes to meet those reduction targets? And as I said, we believe that we have done that in our recommendations. So we had to take into account the role of technologies, the role of livestock population change, human population change, the significance of agriculture to the New Zealand economy. And you know, we took into account previous work that had been done, and particularly by things like the BERG, the Biological Emissions Reference Group, looking at the technologies, how they could be implemented, when they are likely to come on stream, what their costs would be. And so that is how we arrived at our budgets and the agricultural contribution to the overall New Zealand budget. We were also asked a subsidiary question, which was about what could the eventual long-term target for methane be? Well, not to refine the current target, but what could it possibly be beyond 250? And obviously you're into very strong speculative mode when you're doing that. But the approach we took there was to look at the international data, look what is required internationally to meet the 1.5 degree goal. And it's a very complex question, because what you do with methane is not independent of what happens with other gases. And our analysis, well, our thoughts on this based on international analysis are that New Zealand would or could have to meet a reduction that could be lie somewhere between 49 and 60% below 2017 levels. But I would like to stress it's not an easy question to answer. It's not independent of what happens with other gases. So this was quite a speculative piece of additional work that we were asked to do, and is not pertinent in many ways to our first 3 emissions budgets. Next slide for Nicola.
Thank you, Harry.
Hi there. We've just got one question through. Sorry, Nicola, which I thought I'd ask now. We haven't just reminding people to use the Q&A function as we go along. But we've had one through that I think Harry's just pretty much covered, but it'd be good to throw back to you, Harry. Are the targets sufficiently ambitious in that they give us only 66% chance of staying under 1.5 degrees?
I can answer that in two ways. One is that what we are asked to do as the Commission is align with the targets that were set in the Act. In a sense, it's not our job to say, are they sufficiently ambitious? That is set in the Act. It is an important point that when you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecasts of the reductions needed, the reductions they talk about only give us a 66% probability of meeting those climate targets. But as I said, what we are tasked with doing is meeting the current targets. It's the government's job to decide what for the country those targets will be. We have pointed out that there are these probabilities. And if you're looking in our detailed sections, we talk about the different types of variability and probability. But it's a government job to decide how ambitious the national targets should be.
Great, thank you, Harry. I'll just ask one more question before we move on to the next section. I feel like we're probably going to get inundated soon, but we'll make the most of this quieter time. Was any methane from other sources looked at? For example, waste methane?
Yes. In our analysis did look at that. As I said, I think it's just over 90% of the biogenic methane does come from agriculture. And close to 10% from waste. And we do make recommendations around waste. And we do acknowledge that waste may be an area ripe for reductions in New Zealand. And I was very surprised by some of the statistics that came out. We, as on a per capita basis, we produce more waste per head than most other countries. And we produce more emissions for every unit of waste. So it does seem as if there are areas that we can reduce biogenic methane emissions outside of the agricultural sector. And we do make recommendations on that.
Thank you, Harry. That was great. I'll pass back to you, Nicola, now. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so the path for agriculture. We've developed a possible path, or what we're calling our central path. Having said earlier, there were a number of pathways were possible. I think probably one of the important things in this conclusion, in terms of where we got to with all of the various pathways and then settling where we did, is that we are building on, or assuming, if you like, that the historical trends of producing more per animal and reducing methane emissions per unit of product continue. And as a result, we will end up with a steady decrease in methane per kilogram of output. And there are a number of drivers behind that, and I'll go over those shortly. The important one for me anyway was that, we are looking at overall production remaining constant. And to do this, we would need this continuous innovation and adjusting of these farm management practices. Now, whether it's for breeding low emission animals, whether it's managing feed, managing nitrogen, it might be adjusting stocking rates. There's a raft of different things, but these are the number of drivers that are all behind this. But the modelling that we did showed that the production levels would stay relatively constant, but they would require a lot of work by farmers, industry and policy support working together to ensure that, that these things happen. It's not necessarily an easy task to land this, but we did believe that it was possible. And the work of Ewa Kanoa, the partnership to develop the guidance of tools and the various mechanisms that are going to be quite critical in terms of how we achieve this. But it certainly gave us some comfort that we believed that this actually was going to be possible, and that sort of low emissions practices and technologies could be adopted to enable us to get to that target point. I think that was all I was going to cover on that slide. So back to Harry.
Thank you, Nicola. As I said, our analysis suggests that we can meet the lower end of the 250 methane target without the successful development of any new technologies. Going in a sense, repeating what Nicola said, is we have existing practices and some existing technology that can be deployed and that will help us meet the budgets we have set. But we recognize that the existing approaches we have would not, in our assessment, allow us to meet the upper end of that 250 methane target. It would take successful development of new approaches if we were going to meet that the top end of the target. And our advice reflects that. We didn't want, in many ways, we felt it imprudent if we included technologies in our that were not yet successfully commercialized and available to farmers and growers in our budget. So we have, in our budgetary pathways, we see that there are several ways we can meet the target, but we haven't tried to rely on unproven technologies that may or may not eventuate. But what we have done in our advice is to look towards policies that will incentivize and help in the development of new technologies. So we've said there really should be a move towards a pricing system that is currently being worked on with He Waka Eka Noa. That's one of our recommendations. We also think there should be a long-term plan around how we invest in technologies, because we feel that they will be needed in the future to meet the upper end of the ambitious targets. And I'll finish there.
Thank you, Harry and Nicola. We've got a few questions come through. This one for you, Nicola. What are some examples of the kinds of practices farmers can do now to reduce on-farm emissions?
Okay, I think Harry's probably the expert at that, but I'll give it a go. I'm just a farmer. There is technology around breeding, more in the sheep space. I just read something just this morning actually saying that the LIC are now heading off in that area as well. In terms of the various different ways in which people manage their feed, their nitrogen, obviously that's a different gas, but that can also impact on that. I think one of the things that probably is the advice that I would have certainly out of this is to be really clear what your metric is. So have a look at the reports that you get out of your overseer and whatever else and see what your metrics are, and then find other farmers, maybe in your discussion group or your neighbours or whatever, and ask what their metrics are and find out from them, because there'll be a number of interrelated factors that go on any farm that will impact on that metric. And the more you understand about what generates that metric, your emissions metric, the more you can then look at changing things on your own farm. But I think, Harry can certainly give far more technical detail there, whether you want that now, whether you want that at a different in a different forum or Q&A, not sure.
Just to add to that one, I think we have to acknowledge that there is no one route to this, that individual businesses will need to examine their own production systems and look for where they can meet efficiency improvements. And as Nicola said, that can be quite a wide range. You've got to look at fertilizer, feeding practices, grazing management practices, the balance between individual animal performance and stocking rate. All of these things can tweak the emissions from per unit hectare or per unit of feed. And I think the building upon He Waka Eka Noa is around knowing the number, farm plans, and then delivering on those plans, because there will be reduction plans in those. So it's not a nice recipe, here, do this. The recipe is, in a sense, examine your business and look for efficiency gains in every part of your business.
Thank you, Harry. That was great, and Nicola. And we've got another one here. What are the key judgments you've made in determining the level of effort required to reduce methane relative to CO2? I'm not sure if that's one for you, Harry, or...
Well, I again come back to it, is that we were set a minimum level that methane needs to be reduced by. So biogenic methane has its own target, and we were setting our budgets to align with those targets. We didn't decide what the relative balance between those was. The Zero Carbon Act sets out that long-lived gases need to go to net zero, and short-lived gases need to be reduced by a certain amount, and biogenic methane. So we did that. But in saying that, where the other judgments lie, and this comes around to forestry, is how much of the balance, how much of our total our net emissions are a reduction in gross emissions or an increase in sink. So you're balancing carbon absorption with emissions. And we took the view that there is a very strong need to reduce emissions, and that we shouldn't be relying on too much on sinks to absorb carbon. In saying that, sinks will, and this will be the next part, will play a very important part. But that balance between the reduction of short-lived and long-lived gases is set out in the Act. And our job was to get budgets that align with the Act.
Thank you, Harry. I'll just do a couple more questions before we move on to the next session. We've got one here from Peter. It says, Kia ora panelists. The draft advice document states, in setting our path and emissions budget levels, we have conservatively assumed that no new technologies to reduce methane emissions from agriculture are available before 2035. On what basis was this assumption made?
Very basic. Well, are they available now? Could you go out and buy it? Or based on the best information we could get from research, when would these things likely to be available? For example, with methane emissions, we know a number of things are being worked on: vaccines, inhibitors, various feeds, whether it be seaweed through to other feeds. But none of them, they share one thing in common: you can't go out and buy it today. So there has to be judgment on when it will come through. And that needed to look at regulatory pathways. We looked at the information we could get from the research sector around when it projected these things would be there. And we felt it prudent that if we look back in history, the development of vaccines has been going on, at least 15 years in New Zealand. The inhibitors have been going on for 10 years. They still have to go through regulatory processes. And these regulatory processes are not fast, to put it mildly. And even perhaps the one that's closest to market would be a methane inhibitor coming from DSM. And that still hasn't gone through the regulatory processes in New Zealand. It may also have to go through, because of our export dominated sector, we may have to think about codex regulation as well. So, none of these things come quickly. So we did take a prudent, what we term a prudent rather than a conservative approach to thinking about how we can include this in our budgets. But I think it's also important to realize that budgets are reviewed regularly. They're not set in stone and left. And that there is the next set of budgets will be being developed in 2024. So then the progress with the development of new technologies can be looked at then, and budgets amended accordingly if there is successful acceleration of some of these new technologies. So, I think it's there is a built-in safeguard that if we are wrong in our judgment and things come on much quicker, budgets can be adjusted because they are set on a rolling 3-budget cycle.
Thank you, Harry.
If I can add something there to it, I think the other thing is that we are recommending that further funds be available to look into this because it is so important. So yeah, we have to be prudent because we to say we're going to rely on something that may or may not be there is not sensible. But to suggest that more funds or a good level of funds be put into the development of these tools and systems or whatever else it is that comes out of the research is a strong recommendation that we make.
Yeah, I'd just like to back up Nicola on that one. Our analysis suggests that we do need these technologies, and then logically we say, well, if we need them, we better actually put the resources into getting them.
Thank you both. I'll just ask one more before we move on. We've had a couple of questions regarding agriculture's role in the ETS. I know this is something that Hiwaka Ekanoa is working on. Nicola, I wondered if you might want to take this one. Do you think it's appropriate that the agri-industry participate in the ETS?
I think that, as you said, that Hiwaka Ekanoa is picking that role up in terms of how that will evolve. There's a lot of moving parts in that conversation, and that's where both industry and government are working together with that team to really determine what success looks like. Even if you look at it just from a layman's eyes or look at the various ways in which it could work, there are multiple options. And so determining how it'll work, things like grandfathering, how that'll get picked up or not, there's a lot that they're working through. So that's sort of beyond our brief at the moment. It's something that we are looking forward to receiving, and we've certainly recommended that the guidance developed by Hiwaka Ekanoa endures beyond 2025, that this is something that we are wanting to make sure is enduring and does actually bed in well and sensibly, having had good discussion across all industries and with government. So that's very much their task. I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with.
Charlie, in a sense, that was the question about agriculture and the emissions trading scheme was the specific brief of the Interim Climate Change Committee, which a report went to government on that. And the government is now committed to bringing in a pricing scheme. But Hiwaka Ekanoa, in partnership with the partnership of industry and government, is working on what that pricing scheme should look like. And the government there is a commitment to bring in a pricing scheme. It's not necessarily ETS, and I think, as Nicola said, we all look forward to seeing what emerges from the Hiwaka Ekanoa discussions.
Thank you both. That was great. I'll hand back to you now to continue with the slides. We've had some great questions, so thank you.
Okay, so the next slide is the role of forests. So a number of you will have heard our chair talk about we can't plant our way out of this. We've had a lot of conversations around where forestry fits, and as Harry said earlier, it is definitely a carbon sink. We do need our forests for what they call removals. I always thought removals was cutting down trees, but in this terminology, removals is removal of carbon emissions. So bear with me if you get similarly confused. So they are important. But then when we looked at the role that these trees played, and we looked at the intergenerational aspect of carbon sinks, we realized that the native forests have a particularly important role to play. And so we are quite unashamedly, I suppose, putting more emphasis on the native, notwithstanding the fact that pine trees will still play a very important role in getting to 2050, and probably most importantly, they will play an important role in the future bioeconomy. So there's two different aspects of the forestry, but the important one for us to get our heads around is this intergenerational. We can't get to 2050 and then stop. We are looking at the world beyond, and the fact we still need those long-term carbon sinks, and therefore the native forest, the fact that it takes so long and develops in a way that it is still an active carbon sink well after 2050 is an important part of us meeting our budgets. think that was all I was going to say at this point. Harry.
Thank you, Nicola. And really just to put some numbers on Nicola's general narrative there, forestry will have an important role, but we see a greater emphasis on native forestation. And in terms of actual numbers, we have recommended that there'd be around about 300,000 hectares of new native forest be established by 2035. And this would be a considerable increase on what is now around, well, we're looking at 16,000 hectares a year now, but moving that up to around 25,000 hectares a year of new native forests. With respect to exotics, we expect around 25,000 hectares a year of new planting out to 2035. So there's a tipping in the balance between native and exotic afforestation with respect to carbon. And our recommendations are really around the government putting in policies to enable that to happen. Because we recognize that the establishment of native forests is expensive. It also needs very good pest control, good management. And so the government does need to bring in policies to incentivize that change that we are recommending. We do make some other supporting recommendations around forest management and trying to look at whether additional carbon can be stored in pre-1990 forests. And again, and I think repeating something that was mentioned by the Interim Climate Change Committee, was looking at small blocks of forests and vegetation that may be already absorbing carbon that sits outside the current accounting frameworks. That's it.
Thank you both. We've just got a slide on our consultation on the screen, but maybe we'll just halt the slides while we do the final Q&A so we can just see the people are answering. We've got this question here. I'm not sure which of you will want to answer it, so I'll just throw it out. But why are we so hooked on animal farming, in particular dairy, and to maintain the level of milk production, even to increase products per animal? Would a push for diversification not help to reduce greenhouse gases and provide more resilience economically and ecologically to Aotearoa?
Okay, I can have a first bash at that if you like. I think in the detail of the budgets, we do have some land use change, but we just need to think about scale. For example, a small increase or decrease, if you like, in a dairy area, to put that same area into horticulture would double the current horticulture area. So we have to think of existing infrastructure, existing markets, and existing competitive advantage in those markets. So that's part of it. The other is also about suitability of climate, suitability of topography, adaptation to climate change. You know, those, if we think of the hailstorms on Boxing Day, I'm sure that was a stark reminder of the vulnerability that we all have to climate, and that cropping does, especially when it's binary, you either have a crop or you don't. Animals are more, I guess, durable to things like that. But beside that, we do have an existing industry. We're not necessarily protecting that industry, but we're saying everybody will have to change. You know, all industries need to go to a lower emission. We know that our current milk production is the lowest emissions per kilogram of milk in the world. We've just seen that evidence. And we need to maintain that status, and get even better. We're saying that emission is going to drop in our budgets anyway over time. We're recommending further work is done to really cement that. So it's not about cows for cows' sake. It's actually for making sure that we do have low carbon footprint product as part of our role in feeding the world. And that may well be other products, and it will be. I mean, things don't stand still in agriculture and horticulture. There's constant evolution in that space, responding to consumers responding to market requirements. Harry.
I don't think I can really add anything to that one, Nicola, other than I think it is very much we have a strong comparative advantage when it comes to pastoral agriculture. I'm sure that we will, over time, change the mix of what we do, but we may not be able to produce other products with the same relative efficiency as we do animal products. And we have an economy that is animal product and animal product exports contribute a very major part of that export economy. That doesn't mean we're wedded to it, but I think we have to accept the reality. We have a highly developed and highly efficient livestock sector, and our climate, soils, etc., give us an advantage over everyone else. We will change over time, but our role was not to say we want to move into any type of farming or not. Our farming has developed without subsidies. It's actually developed through taking advantage of international markets. And I think that will continue. Our role, in a sense, was to say, how can we meet the budgets? And that's what we've tried to do. But we are not saying or trying to prescribe what type of farming New Zealand should have. We think that is a business decision by individuals and whatever government policy wants to do around incentives.
Thank you both. That was great. Good answers. And we've got quite a long question here from Sam, so I'm just going to try and condense it slightly. We can continue improving our technologies for farming, but did any of your modelling take into account the bigger picture of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide if we are to reduce our livestock or animal agriculture? If we cut livestock to reduce our emissions or have to reduce our animal agriculture, this demand of meat and dairy will then be taken up by other countries which produce more emissions worldwide, thereby increasing overall emissions rather than reducing, which doesn't seem logical.
Can I boil that down to a leakage argument? Is the argument about leakage that if there is demand for the kind of animal products we produce, if we produce them most efficiently, is it illogical that we reduce? Because if someone else takes up the slack, the emissions would be greater globally. Is that the question? If I've interpreted that correctly,
I think so. Yeah,
that was taken into account. You know, it is a very important issue around if we don't produce it, does someone else produce it with more emissions? And that's something we did. It was looked at in our analysis. It was also looked at by the Interim Climate Change Committee. One of the issues with that, it does become a little bit more complex because it depends who takes up the slack if we don't produce. They may produce it with slightly more emissions than we do, but if they have an emissions cap within their economy, they would have to reduce their emissions somewhere else within the economy. So it becomes quite complicated to decide how much that leakage is. So from memory from the Interim Climate Change Committee, it came to a tentative conclusion that within dairy, the leakage, the main competitors to us in our main markets would be countries that would also have relatively low emissions per unit product and have strong emissions caps across the economy. So there is unlikely to be any major issue with leakage. In the beef and sheep sector, it was slightly different because the competitors were different. And there was a tentative, again, conclusion, I think, that there could be a leakage issue.
Thank you, Harry. Did you
Can I add some? Yeah, I just add something because I think it's a very important question because New Zealand isn't alone in the world. We are part of a global picture. We're part of a global picture from our emissions profile, which is very different for a developed country. And therefore, it is something that we grapple with. And I think it also reminds me of the fact that, yes, climate change is a very important factor, and it's what we're focusing on, but it doesn't stand alone. You know, there are other roles that New Zealand plays in the world, and one of them is providing nutrients to the world. And so how that actually fits with all of our requirements to fit within world rulings or world guidance. You know, Paris Accord is quite clear that, you know, the food production shouldn't be shouldn't be at risk given climate change incentives. So globally, we still have to feed the world, and we do have those discussions. I can vouch for that.
Thank you both. We've got one on soil carbon here. Where will soils play a role in this process? Farmers are now increasing soil carbon at rates of 10 tonnes of carbon per year under managed holistic grazing. Soils are the largest land-based carbon sink next to the ocean.
Do you want me to answer that one, Nicola?
Absolutely. I think that's a scientist answer.
I think there are many claims about soil carbon being increased. If we look into the scientific literature, we look into the evidence base we have from New Zealand, our best evidence from controlled studies is that on average, we are not changing carbon. That does not mean that there aren't individuals, there aren't individual locations and individual circumstances where carbon is changing. What it does mean is the best evidence we have, and I'm not claiming that that is great, but the best evidence that we can get together is that carbon stocks are not increasing across New Zealand. In some places, they may be increasing. In some places, they may be decreasing. And so in devising emissions budgets, there really isn't the evidence base for us to incorporate soil carbon removal, the increase in soil carbon, the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through soil carbon. That again, that doesn't mean you can't in the future. And certainly at the moment, there is a major study being undertaken across New Zealand where soil carbon has been monitored at 500 locations for 12 years to actually better get the evidence base. There are investments going into various forms of agricultural practices that are claimed to increase soil carbon, and they will be monitored over time. And time is a really critical issue here because the rates of soil carbon are affected both by management and climate, and such that we have to ensure that the rates are not just one-off rates, that they continue into the future, and that any locking up of carbon is permanent. And we just do not have the evidence to actually give us the confidence that soil carbon can be included in our budgets. And then that may change over time, but our analysis is that at the moment, we do not have the evidence to allow us to factor them into budgets.
I think that there's another angle, and Harry, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that our level of soil carbon is actually quite high compared with many places around the world. And I think if anything, I would be concerned of land use changes that actually start to deplete it. Whatever we do going forward, we need to make sure we maintain at the very least our high level that is there because of our pasture base. And so that's something I think we need to be keeping a really close eye on.
Absolutely. And I think we do have to be quite careful. If you look at research around the world, there is some strong evidence that you can increase soil carbon, but they are usually from areas where soil carbon has been run down. In New Zealand, we're starting from a very different base. We have permanent pastures that in general have been well managed. And so we start from a high base. And starting from a high base is always more difficult than starting from a low base. And in some areas, as Nicola said, the evidence is that we really need to focus on maintaining what we've got. And that's a priority. Yes, there will be some areas we can increase, I'm sure of that. But maintaining what we've got may well be a very big task in itself. But that high levels that we have already gives us a more daunting task than if we in actual fact had badly managed our soils in the first place.
Thank you. We've had quite a few questions on incentivizing native forests, so I'll just read one of them. What do the panelists think about continuous cover forestry regimes with native forests established on marginal farmland, i.e. limited careful harvest of high-value timber in near-to-nature forestry regimes? Permanent forest cover is maintained along with all the high forest ecosystem services, and there is a future revenue stream for landowners. This has been demonstrated in the Totara industry project on Northland farmland.
I'm happy to kick off. I didn't quite catch the first part of the question, but I think in terms of the way in which native forests can be incentivized, I think if we step back a bit, if I look at, and certainly from my perspective, if I'm looking at putting in forestry, we have exotic trees. We're actually in the process of harvesting some at the moment. The critical part is that they are easy to access and easy to harvest, close to roads, and big enough block to actually make it worthwhile the contractors coming and getting that job done. Now, we also have lots of pockets of bits of land around the farm that in the past we would have just put trees in. Now we probably would just let that revert to native, or possibly give it some stimulus to revert to native faster, maybe with some ground cover, planting, and that also will improve the biodiversity and a whole raft of other things that are going on the farm. And so I'm not familiar with the Northland project. I'd love to find more out about that, and hopefully offline we can do that. But if you think about that type of process where we're saying it's fitness for purpose, where would we enable in the native forest to expand and to fill those pockets, and where will exotics be best placed and most useful? And that's really the balance that we're hoping will come through in terms of the incentives that will be put into place by government.
Charlie, I think Ben might actually be able to better answer that, because there was I just remember a conversation around, it's not a stark contrast between permanent native forest and exotic harvested forest, that there can be a number of alternatives in between, and that could have been long-lived pines that become permanent pines, or a native forest where you do selective harvesting. And there was a term for it. Was it called nature-friendly forestry or something? There was a term, but maybe Ben can expand on that. And I know there was a discussion about that and potential role.
Oh, here he is. I was just going to see if he was able to jump in.
Yeah, good everyone. I'm a senior analyst here at the Climate Change Commission, and thanks, Harry, for passing over to me. Yeah, we've been looking at a range of different kind of options for forestry moving forward in New Zealand, and we quite often talk about kind of permanent native forests and exotic plantation forests, but there is a mix of forestry management options between there. And I think we talk about in our advice kind of diversifying a bit the overall kind of forestry landscape in New Zealand, and looking at options of continuous cover forestry, integration of different types of species. So there is work to be done there. In terms of the kind of the modeling and things that we do, it does look at a more simple basis between permanent native forests and plantation exotic forests. But as Harry said, there is a range in there, and it would be good to see more evidence and research done in New Zealand to highlight the potential for those different regimes, both for on the economic side, on the carbon sequestration side, and the other benefits that we know forests provide that we really value around biodiversity and other things too.
Thank you, Ben, and to Harry and Nicola for your answers as well. We've got one here. How does the advice regarding increases in animal productivity per head compare to historic data? Is it feasible to assume that productivity will remain stable while meeting the targets?
I don't think it would be feasible to assume that the past increases per head can go on forever. I think we would have some difficulty justifying that. But we, in actual fact, took into account that there could be a tailing off of those efficiency gains. But when you actually look, particularly in the dairy sector, you look at our yield per animal is low compared to other types of animals in the dairy sector. And there is still scope to increase yield per head. Perhaps when you're looking at, Nicola's probably more an expert here, in the carcass weights and growth rates, maybe that will start to tail off more than the yield per head in the dairy sector. But we did factor into account that you can't keep historical trends going forever, and there is likely to be a tail off in the absolute amount, but we still thought that there was sufficient scope to increase that in the short term to meet the budgets.
Yeah, I think our timeline is relatively short term. I always get nervous when I see people extrapolating lines. So, but it's a modelling exercise, and numbers had to be derived. And so if you look at how there are farms who can produce at levels per head and then emissions per kilogram of output differently to other farms, it's what do we learn from that, and how can we then take that into the industry through advisory, through all the various extension and research processes that are there, farmer to farmer connections, to help that learning and those practices actually be put into place. So I've always been the first critic of anyone who says we're going to bring the bottom 25% up to the medium, because that's arithmetically impossible. But I still, there is still scope there, as Harry says, that to improve both the productivity and the emissions. The sheep and beef one is a difficult extrapolation, because the extrapolation, you go back far enough, was from very low lambing percent, very low per carcass, high subsidised, high stocking rate, totally government-driven policy in those days, and now we are very much lower numbers, much higher production per sheep, much higher carcass weights. Can that line carry on like that? Wow. Who knows? But science, that's the challenge. That's why this research must continue, and all agricultural research must continue to help us get to a point where we can be sure that we can improve that productivity and reduce the emissions in tandem. And I think breeding actually has a huge part to play here, and I'm really pleased to see that the sheep industry has actually taken such a leading role in that. And it's, if we can do it through genetics, then that's great too. So, I mean, it's using all the tools in the toolbox to make sure that we can achieve these outcomes.
Thank you. We've got just 8 minutes left, so I think we'll ask one more and see where we're at with timing then. It's great to see so many detailed questions coming through, and thank you to Harry and Nicola for giving such great answers. I think this one might have already been answered in the course of the last hour, but I'm just going to throw it out there anyway. How much resiliency and redundancy is there in the plan? Would the failure of any of the many sub-areas to achieve the targeted reductions mean the total reductions were no longer on target?
That's sort of a modeller's question in a way. It is. We did try to ensure we were always looking at the total system. It's not component bits that do their thing independently of others, and it's how does it all pull together. But Ben's come on, so there we go. Perhaps he can segue to his expertise.
And I will hand over to Ben, but just I think one thing is that we didn't just look at one in a sense one scenario as to how the budgets could be met. We wanted to ensure that if that didn't eventuate, was there another route by which that budget could be met? And I think Ben probably outlined that in more detail. But what we didn't want to do was to rely on there's one route. If that route fails, we're lost. We wanted to say that these budgets could be achieved by different routes, so that there was a robustness built into our modelling and our achievement of the budgets we are recommending. Ben?
Yeah, really great question. And Nicola and Harry have really spoken to the core of it. In our work, we looked at a range of possible scenarios about how different things might occur in terms of what reductions might be possible through technology development, but maybe some of those technology developments occur more quickly or more slowly, also through behavior change in society and on farm, and how much emissions, how the scale of emissions reductions achieved through that might be higher or lower. So we consider kind of a range of scenarios, and then our work was to try and choose a kind of our central path that was a responsible path between those scenarios that would take into account that the future might look relatively different. Also, sorry that all the lights just turned off in the room that I'm in, so I've suddenly gone dark because I'm the only person in the room. But I'll just continue briefly with my in this weird format. So our path tries to take into account the fact that these futures might be different, and should have enough sort of redundancy in there so that if it doesn't work out exactly as sort of imagined on one front, there's room in other areas to make that up. And I would just point anyone interested in this to check out evidence report. In the evidence report online, chapters 8 and 9 do a really good job of outlining the different scenarios we considered, the assumptions around those, so you can see those differences. But ultimately, of course, if emissions reductions aren't achieved in one sector, they do need to occur somewhere. So we can't predict the future exactly, but we can try and plot a responsible course between the different futures we can envision.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate you jumping in there. So we're almost at the end of the session. So thank you to everyone who came today. It's been really great to hear from you all, and we hope you have learned a lot. I'll just pop a link to the consultation site in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And as I said at the beginning, consultation is open until the 14th of March. And we'll be running more of these sessions between now and then. So keep an eye on our website and social media channels. I'll share the link to our events page in the chat now, which is where you can see all of our upcoming online sessions, if any more take your interest. So just to round us off, I'm going to hand over to Bevan for a closing karakia.
Kia ora tātou. Kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, ake, āmini.